My children chose the father who abandoned them and despised the one who was always there. When he left again, they returned seeking comfort. I am 38 years old and the mother of two teenagers, Gabriel, 17, and Clara, 16. Our biological father, Julian, has been a constant source of problems since the moment he entered our lives. To understand all of this, I need to start from the beginning, because nothing that has happened makes sense without the proper context. I met Julian when I was 19, and to be honest, I couldn't have been more naive. My parents hated him from the very beginning, which, of course, made him all the more appealing to me. Typical teenage rebellion. Julian was trouble from the start, but I didn't want to see it. He would disappear for days without telling me where he was going. He always talked about miraculous business deals that, according to him, would make us rich in no time. But it was never about actually working. When I had Gabriel at 21, I thought it would be a wake-up call for him. But if he was already irresponsible before, he got even worse afterward. The following year Clara was born, and by then the disaster was obvious. He would stay out all night without explanation, while I dealt alone with two babies. If I complained, he would say he was working, even though I never saw a penny of his supposed salary. But the worst came when Gabriel was 3 and Clara was 2. Julian, in his infinite stupidity, decided to rob a store with a gun because he owed money to some drug dealers. And it wasn't just any robbery. He brutally beat the 18-year-old who was working there, causing permanent brain damage. When a customer tried to stop him, Julian fired. Fortunately, he missed, but the man ended up in intensive care after diving behind a shelf to avoid the bullet. I received the call from the police at 2 in the morning. They asked me if I knew where Julian was, and I, who hadn't seen him for 3 days, had no idea. It was during that call that I found out he was wanted for armed robbery and attempted murder. I felt like my world was collapsing. He was arrested 2 days later, trying to buy drugs with the stolen money. The entire incident was captured on security cameras. He was ultimately sentenced to 12 years for aggravated assault, robbery, and attempted murder. It could have been worse. The prosecutor wanted to take him to trial for attempted first-degree murder, but he accepted a plea deal. The first few years without him were a nightmare. I worked in a cafe during the day and cleaned offices at night to pay the rent for a modest apartment. My mother helped when she could, but her health no longer allowed her to care for the children. Over time, the children barely remembered their father, which, frankly, was a relief. When Gabriel asked about him, he was told that his father had gone to work far away and would be back for a while. There was no point in explaining that his father was in prison for almost killing someone. Money was a constant struggle. I had to choose between buying food or paying the electricity bill. I remember one Christmas when I could only afford to give each child a small gift. I cried all day looking at social media filled with photos of families with piles of presents. I even thought my children would be better off without me. I wondered if I shouldn't give them up for adoption to a family that could give them everything I couldn't. Dark thoughts, I know, but at that level of exhaustion and despair, the mind goes to terrifying places. I lived like that for almost 3 years. A single mother, exhausted, barely surviving. Raising 2 little ones who didn't understand why we lived in such poverty. Sometimes I felt like I was drowning and there was no one there to throw me a lifeline. But life surprises you in places as simple as the cereal aisle of a supermarket. It was a Sunday. I was doing the shopping with the little money I had left after paying bills. Anyone who's ever been to the supermarket with kids knows how difficult it is, but doing it without money is a whole other level of stress. Gabriel threw himself on the floor screaming because I couldn't buy him the name-brand cereal he wanted. Clara started crying too, and people were staring at us as if I were a terrible mother. I was on the verge of collapse when a man approached and started talking to Gabriel. He didn't do it condescendingly, but with empathy. He explained that the healthiest cereals would make him strong like a superhero and that if he ate them every day he could run faster and jump higher. Gabriel stopped crying in seconds. That stranger managed to calm him down in what had taken me 10 minutes without success. He introduced himself as Marcos. He had a contagious calmness. He was well dressed, wearing expensive work boots. She exuded confidence, something I'd forgotten existed. We continued talking in the checkout line. She asked about the children, and I told her the basics: single mother, absent father, doing my best to make ends meet. I thought he'd leave quickly, like everyone else, but no. Marcos was genuinely interested. He asked their ages, what they liked, if they played any games. 6 months after we started dating, Marcos was coming over often. At first, it was just for dinner or to watch movies on weekends, but little by little he became a part of our lives. He fixed things I couldn't, like the leaky faucet, the wobbly table, the fan that made strange noises. She helped Gabriel with his homework, not just once out of obligation, but every day. She would sit with him at the kitchen table to solve math problems. Clara would also bring him her schoolwork, and he would celebrate her grades just as much as his brothers. He never tried to take on the role of father right away. He was just there, always, keeping his promises. Helping without being asked and treating my children as if they truly mattered. Something so new for us, after so many years of disappointments. The first time Gabriel called him Dad was the day Marcos taught him to ride a bike in the parking lot behind the building. One afternoon Gabriel fell and scraped his knee pretty badly. Without thinking, he ran to Marcos crying, "Dad, it hurts." I stood there silently, holding my breath, waiting to see how he would react. But Marcos simply picked him up and carried him inside to clean his wound. As if it were the most natural thing in the world. He didn't correct him, he didn't make any awkward comments. He just acted like any parent would. At that moment I knew he was different from any other man I'd ever been with. It took Clara a little longer to accept Marcos as a father figure, but when she finally did, she went all in. He'd sit with her and watch those endless movies about dolls, let her paint his nails with bleach, and still bring them to work like nothing was wrong. I would read stories at night, using a different voice for each character. When we moved in together, the children were 7 and 6 years old, and living together felt so natural that it seemed as if we had always been a family. Marcos never complained about suddenly having a house full of toys, nor about having to share me with 2 little ones who demanded constant attention. Looking back, I think those were the happiest years of my life. I finally felt stable, secure, and that I had someone I could truly trust. I wasn't alone in everything anymore. But, as is often the case, that peace didn't last. Everything crumbled with a simple phone call. I was in the middle of my shift at the hospital when my cell phone started vibrating. It was an unknown number that kept calling. Thinking it might be an emergency, I answered. To my surprise, it was Linda, Julian's mother. I hadn't heard from that woman in over 10 years. She started in a sweet tone, asking how I was, how the children were, trying to sound friendly. As if we were lifelong friends, when in reality we hadn't spoken since Julian went to prison. I wondered what she wanted, because she had never shown any interest in Gabriel and Clara. She never looked after them, never offered any help when I could barely manage everything. She acted as if she were nowhere to be seen for years, and now she was reappearing with fake smiles. Then she dropped the bombshell. Julian would be released from prison in 2 months. According to her, he had been an exemplary prisoner. He took anger management classes, became a believer, and had gone through a full rehabilitation process. Linda kept talking without pausing, describing how incarceration had changed him, how he was now a new man. Completely different from the one I met more than a decade ago. I was in the hospital's waiting room, trying to process what I was hearing as she recited phrases about second chances, about faith, about how Julian constantly talked about the children and regretted missing out on their lives. She said he had their baby pictures taped up in his cell, that he had saved the little money he earned working in prison to buy them gifts when he got out. A whole manipulation strategy, but designed to hit right where it hurts. Inside, she was completely torn. On one hand, Julian had chosen drugs and crime, and in doing so, had endangered other people's lives. On the other, Gabriel and Clara were her biological children. Did they have the right to know their father if he truly wanted to change? The worst part was that Linda would call when the children weren't around. She hadn't told them anything yet. She kept pressing them, asking what they were interested in, what sports they played, what their plans were after school. He feigned a paternal interest he hadn't shown in over 10 years. Finally, I decided to tell Marcos everything that was happening. His reaction was immediate. He wasn't happy at all. I wondered why she was even considering the idea. Why dredge up the past when we already had a stable, happy family? She was worried the children would get their hopes up only to be disappointed again. But I clung to the possibility that Julian had changed. And that perhaps the boys deserved to know who their biological father was if he was truly trying to redeem himself. Besides, Linda's insistent calls, always talking about what was best for the children and second chances, were emotionally draining me. So, against Marcos's advice, I gathered Gabriel and Clara together and told them what was happening. I told them that Julian was getting out of prison and wanted to see them. Their reactions were just as I expected. Gabriel was curious, though not overly excited. Clara, on the other hand, was more reserved. She barely remembered Julian, and Marcos was the only father she really knew. They asked me basic questions. Where had he been? In prison? Why did he leave? Had he made bad decisions? If he was dangerous, I told them no, although deep down I wasn't sure. And what hurt me the most was when they asked if that meant Marcos wasn't their dad anymore. I assured them no, that nothing would change that. Linda, of course, was thrilled when I told her they had agreed to meet Julian. She arranged the meeting at a restaurant chain she called Neutral Ground. She promised to be there to mediate and make sure everyone felt comfortable. Looking back, should have noticed how planned everything was. That day, I was a nervous wreck. Marcos came with us, not only because I didn't want to face it alone, but also because, deep down, I wanted Julian to see that we had built a life without him. The children were nervous, but they tried to act mature. When Julian appeared, he was a far cry from the man who had been arrested 12 years earlier. He had gained muscle mass and, although he tried to appear humble, he brought with him a whole performance of remorse. He spoke of how much he missed them, how he thought of them every day, how much he regretted everything. The children, despite their reservations, listened attentively. Gabriel asked him about what it was like to live in prison, and Julian, instead of conveying what that meant, told stories that sounded more like adventures than punishments. Clara stayed close to Marcos, though she never stopped listening attentively. By the end of the meeting, Julian had already scheduled another visit for the following week. And that's when I realized I had made a grave mistake. But by then, it was too late. The damage was done, and Julian was only just beginning his game. He started seeing Gabriel and Clara every weekend. At first, everything seemed harmless. They went out to eat, went to the movies, normal things between a father and his children. He was staying at Linda's house while he looked for a job and a place of his own. I wanted to believe he was really trying to change. But I soon noticed certain changes in the children, especially in the way they interacted with Marcos. At first, they were subtle things that I tried to ignore. Gabriel stopped asking Marcos for help with his car, even though Marcos had been teaching him how to maintain it for months. Clara no longer wanted Marcos to help her with her hair or braid it. She preferred to wear her hair loose or style it herself. And that's when I knew everything was starting to break down. Everything began to change subtly, almost imperceptibly. During family dinners, my children started to fall silent, engrossed in their phones instead of sharing how their day had been, as they used to do. When Marcos asked them about school or their friends, they answered with monosyllables, without interest, as if they were enduring his presence rather than enjoying it. Little by little, Julian began to influence them more directly. After each weekend they spent with him, they returned with new ideas about what family meant, what loyalty meant, and what, according to him, a real father did. He told them he had been unjustly imprisoned, which was completely false. There was security footage that clearly showed him hitting a store employee with a weapon, but he had fabricated a whole story about being in the wrong place at the wrong time and being the victim of an unjust system. According to Julian, he was just trying to support his family and ended up getting involved with the wrong people. He claimed the robbery was someone else's idea and that he was simply keeping watch. That didn't explain why the security cameras showed him with the gun in his hand, committing the violent act. Even so, he managed to convince the boys that the video was taken out of context. But the worst part was how he talked about Marcos. He put it in their heads that Marcos had stolen from his family while he was in prison, that I only married him for financial stability because he hadn't been there to take care of us. According to Julian, if he had never gone to prison, we would still be together as a happy family. She portrayed Marcos as an opportunist who took advantage of a single, vulnerable mother, instead of acknowledging him as the man who was there when we needed him most. And my children began to believe that version. Gabriel, who had been calling Marcos Dad for 12 years, suddenly started calling him by his name, as if he were just an acquaintance. When I asked him why he did it, he replied that Julian had told him it was disrespectful to call another man Dad if his biological father was still alive. From then on, they started comparing everything Marcos did with what Julian would do in his place. If Marcos got emotional at one of Clara's school events, they said that real men don't show emotions. If I asked them to tidy up the kitchen, they'd reply that Julian understood and wouldn't complain about such things. Every time Marcos tried to correct them or set boundaries, they questioned me for having chosen him, as if I'd been forced to wait 12 years for a man who'd been imprisoned for violent crimes. They criticized me for not taking them to visit him in prison, for not telling them how much I missed them, or for trying to rebuild my life. But what really broke me was discovering that Julian was asking them for money. I found out by accident while checking Gabriel's bank statement. This guy, who only worked part-time at a video game store, was transferring his entire paycheck to his father every week. When I confronted him, he told me that Julian was trying to get ahead and needed help with his expenses. The same was true for Clara. She, who worked at a shopping mall, also gave him some of her money. Meanwhile, Marcos was the one covering her insurance, phone bills, college savings, clothes, gas, food, everything. But Julian was the one who supposedly deserved her support because he was her real father. So I called him directly. I asked him, "Are you really comfortable letting a 17-year-old boy pay your bills? Aren't you ashamed?" And he, without the slightest embarrassment, replied that Gabriel had offered, that he wasn't forcing him to do anything, that he was just accepting his help. As if that were something to applaud. I tried talking to Clara too, explaining how unfair all this was, but she didn't understand either. My children were completely manipulated by someone who knew exactly what to say to manipulate their emotions. The disrespect shown to Marcos grew every week. They responded to him with sarcasm and ignored him when he asked them for something. They argued about every decision he made as a father figure. Julian had convinced them that Marcos had no right to act as their father because they didn't share his blood. And Marcos, quite rightly, began to distance himself. After more than a decade raising those children, loving them as his own, sacrificing himself daily for them, he began to behave more like a roommate than a father. He no longer offered to help them, didn't ask about their classes or their worries. And if they noticed, they didn't seem to care. I tried to talk to each of them. I told them what Julian had really done, why he'd been in prison, how he was using them for money and recognition, without contributing anything real to their lives. But they insisted he had changed, that I was being unfair by continuing to bring up his past. They couldn't see that Julian wasn't trying to repair his relationship with his father, but rather to feed his ego and his wallet at the expense of those who loved him unconditionally. Julian knew he couldn't compete with Marcos when it came to being a real father. So he opted for another strategy, to undermine him, change the narrative, portray himself as the victim, and make Marcos seem like the intruder. And it worked. By the time I finally realized how serious the situation was, they were already completely under his influence. They began to see Marcos as an obstacle instead of the man who had raised them. And then, everything exploded. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Julian was coming to pick up Gabriel and Clara for their weekend visit. I usually went outside to meet him, I didn't want him inside my house. But that day, Gabriel had forgotten his sneakers and went upstairs to get them. Julian stayed in the living room, as if he owned the place, brazenly looking around. He was talking about the furniture, about the big-screen TV Marcos had painstakingly bought for Christmas the year before. It was clear he was assessing things, comparing our lives to his own in the basement of his mother's house. And then he noticed the family photos. Marcos's pictures with the boys at school events, on vacation, at birthdays. Pictures of a real family. And that's when he started talking nonsense. She said that Marcos was just playing at having a family, that the children needed a real father figure, not someone who tried to buy their affection with gifts and outings. And she said this in front of Gabriel and Clara, without any respect, inside the very house of the man who had always been there for them. I could see Marcos start to tense up, although at first he remained calm. She asked Julian, firmly but without raising her voice, to moderate his language and remember what kind of house he was in. But Julian had no intention of calming down. In fact, his attitude became even more provocative. The most frustrating thing was seeing Gabriel and Clara just standing there, watching their biological father behave in a completely disrespectful way toward the man he had been, a father figure to them for over 10 years. They didn't say a word, they didn't stop him, they didn't defend Marcos. It was as if they agreed with everything Julian said. Then, Julian said something I'll never forget. He stared at Marcos, looked him straight in the eyes, and said coldly, "These children don't need a stranger playing dad just because you couldn't have kids." Marcos's expression at that moment was devastating. It was as if he'd been slapped. And the worst was yet to come. Julian approached and pushed him with such force that he slammed against the wall. The impact was so strong that for a moment I thought Marcos might have been seriously injured. What happened next was undoubtedly one of the most shocking and cathartic scenes I've ever witnessed. Marcos, whom Julian had completely underestimated, responded with a determination no one expected. It turns out he'd practiced boxing in college in his youth, and although he hadn't trained in years, he hadn't forgotten a thing. Julian ended up on the floor, and it wasn't just a simple shove. It was a full-blown beating, a broken nose, possibly fractured ribs, and blood splattered all over the living room floor. Marcos didn't stop with just one blow. He unleashed years of pent-up contempt in barely half a minute, until Julian was curled up in a ball, begging him to stop. But what truly turned my stomach happened right after. While Marcos was still standing, breathing heavily, and Julian lay wounded on the ground, Gabriel and Clara began shouting at Marcos to stop. My own children, whom he had raised with so much love, were crying, calling him crazy and asking how he could hurt their real father like that. Gabriel even tried to intervene, pushing Marcos away from Julian and yelling at him to stay away from his dad. Meanwhile, Clara knelt beside Julian, worried about his condition, asking if he needed an ambulance, as if he were the victim. They were protecting the same man who had just violently broken into our home and assaulted Marcos. And Julian, of course, took advantage of the moment to play the martyr. He was whimpering and telling the boys, "Do you see the kind of person your mother chose to marry? Is this the man you want to raise you?" The manipulation was so obvious to me, but they believed it all. I couldn't take it anymore and I snapped. I yelled at them that Julian had thrown the first punch, that Marcos had defended himself, that they had just witnessed with their own eyes the kind of person their biological father really was. But nothing I said seemed to sink in. Gabriel insisted that Julian only wanted to talk and that Marcos had attacked him for no reason. Clara said that now she was afraid of Marcos, that she saw him as violent, out of control. They couldn't, or wouldn't, see that it had all been orchestrated by Julian to discredit Marcos and further alienate them from him. Julian, playing the wounded victim, struggled to his feet, groaning in pain, and told the children they didn't need to go out with him that day, as he wasn't feeling well enough to do anything fun. But, of course, he said it loud enough for everyone to hear, as if the sole purpose of his visit had been to have an innocent chat that ended in aggression, which he blamed on Marcos, when Julian finally left, limping and clutching his ribs like an actor in a cheap soap opera. The most heated argument I'd ever had with my children began. They confronted me, saying that Marcos had lost control, that Julian only wanted to spend time with them, that they were afraid to live under the same roof as someone like him. I tried to explain to them, again and again, that Julian had provoked everything, that he had attacked first, that every word he said was intended to hurt and belittle the man who had raised them. But they had already taken sides. For them, what they had seen had no context or explanation. They only saw Marcos as the aggressor and Julian as the poor victim. That night, Marcos barely said a word. He locked himself in our room and didn't come out. When I went to look for him later, I found him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. His face was empty, as if something very deep inside him had been ripped away. He looked like he'd been destroyed. It was at that moment that I knew, with a painful certainty, that we had lost our children. Julian had won, after 12 years of giving his all, of being an exemplary father. Gabriel and Clara had chosen to believe a man with a violent, manipulative past who had never been there for them, and to reject the one who had always been there. Marcos told me, bluntly, that he no longer trusted them. He couldn't keep giving his heart to two young men who rejected him the moment the man who had given them life appeared. But he never earned the right to call himself their father. And deep down, I understood his decision. After everything that had happened, I couldn't blame him for anything. The saddest thing was seeing that Gabriel and Clara expected everything to go back to normal, as if none of this had happened. They wanted Marcos to continue paying their car insurance, to keep helping with college applications, to keep being their dad, as long as it suited them. But at the same time, they wanted to keep seeing Julian, treating him as if he were the hero of this whole story. When in reality, he was the one who started a fight in our living room. A violent man, with a criminal record, whom they now admired. I had to make a decision. And, to be honest, it wasn't that difficult once I really thought about it. I chose my husband, the man who had been by our side every day for over 10 years. The one who chose to take on a role that wasn't his to assume, out of obligation. Who cared for and loved my children as if they were his own flesh and blood. I chose him over two teenagers who preferred to give their loyalty to someone they barely knew, simply because he shared some DNA with them. I sat Gabriel and Clara down and laid out their options clearly. If they wanted Julian to be their father figure, if that was truly what they wanted, then they would also have to give up everything that came with having Marcos as their father. No more insurance payments, no more phone lines in their name, no more college fund, no more family vacations, nothing. If Julian was such a good father, then he should take care of their needs. He should be the one to support them. You should have seen their faces when I explained what that meant in concrete terms. Goodbye to unlimited data plans on their phones. I suggested basic phones, the kind that are only good for calls and texts. Phones they could pay for with what they earned from their part-time jobs. No car insurance. If they wanted to go to school or work, they could walk or take the bus. And the college fund, the one Marcos had built up over years working overtime and taking on side jobs, was gone too. I had saved that money thinking I could give them opportunities he never had. But if Julian was their real father, then he could take care of their education. I also told them I wasn't planning on becoming their personal driver to go and visit him. If they were so eager to see him, they could find their own way to get there. I wasn't going to waste my gas or my free time taking them to pay homage to the man who attacked my husband in our own home. My family was completely divided after this decision. My mother thinks I'm being cruel to two confused teenagers who don't understand what they're doing. She insists they're just kids who made a mistake and that I should be the adult, the one who fixes everything. On the other hand, my sister told me that I'm finally standing up for myself, defending my marriage, instead of letting everyone walk all over me. Julian's family is calling me all sorts of names. His mother, Linda, leaves me offensive messages on my voicemail saying that I'm poisoning the children, that I'm driving them away from their father. Which is ironic, coming from a woman who disappeared for 12 years and only came back when Julian got out of prison. But you know what bothers me most about all these people who now think they have the right to lecture me about family and forgiveness? Where were they when I really needed them? When I was working double shifts so I could feed her for dinner? When I couldn't afford Christmas presents? When I was drowning as a single mother with two small babies? None of them showed up, but now they want to tell me how to run my family. The guys tried every manipulation technique possible to change my mind, they cried. They accused me of choosing Marcos over them, saying they didn't understand why I was being so harsh, why I couldn't just forgive and forget. And I calmly explained that they had already made their decision when they chose Julian as their real father and started treating Marcos like just another tenant. Marcos changed all the passwords to the family accounts, removed them from the phone plan, and stopped paying their car insurance, just as I asked. When Gabriel's car broke down, he went straight to Marcos for help, as if nothing had happened. Marcos simply told him to ask his real father, since that was the one he had chosen. And the expression on Gabriel's face was one of utter surprise, as if he were only then understanding that Julian knew nothing about mechanics and had no other skills besides that. Manipulating and destroying, but that was no longer Marcos's problem. Gabriel had chosen his path, now he had to face it. And exactly 2 weeks later, Julian did what he always did, disappear without a trace. He stopped answering calls and messages. The boys were devastated, calling their grandmother to see if she knew anything about him, asking if something had happened to him. Classic Julian behavior. He talked a lot about having changed, about being a new man. But he disappeared as soon as the slightest responsibility as a father arose. It turned out he was arrested again on assault charges, after a fight in a park. So that's how the charade of him finding God in prison and being a reformed man fell apart. The guys found out when Linda called them crying, saying Julian was back in jail and needed bail money. Guess who they expected me to help with that? Me, of course. I didn't agree. And now, suddenly, Gabriel and Clara want everything to go back to the way it was. They start treating Marcos well, asking if they can get back on the family phone plan, if he can help them again with the university situation. But Marcos was clear. That chapter is over. He said that seeing them choose Julian over him, after everything he had done for them, was one of the most humiliating experiences of his life. He couldn't keep pretending to be their father when they made it clear they didn't see him that way. That relationship broke down the day they decided blood was worth more than the man who had actually raised them. Some people think I'm wrong for supporting my husband instead of forcing a family reconciliation. But that's not the case. These boys aren't 6 or 7 years old. They're 17 and 16. They knew perfectly well what they were doing when they chose their biological father, with a history of violence, over the man who had always been there for them. Marcos gave more than 10 years of his life to children who weren't his own. He could have chosen to date someone without children, start his own family, and avoid all this drama. But he didn't. He believed in us. He gave his all. And he ended up heartbroken by 2 ungrateful teenagers who discarded him for a man who was never good enough. I'm not going to force him to open his heart again just because my children realized they were wrong. Some bridges can't be rebuilt once they've burned completely. And some lessons can only be learned the hard way. Julian is back in prison, where he belongs. My children have finally discovered their true father's worth. And Marcos is no longer anyone's backup plan. Perhaps Gabriel and Clara will think twice before mistreating the people who truly loved them again. Or perhaps not. In any case, it's no longer my burden. I made a decision and I don't regret it.